Great. So honestly, we're so excited to see everyone here, and the excitement and registrations for this resource were absolutely fantastic. So my name is Mo, and I organise with Abolitionist Futures. And if you haven't come to one of our events before, we try our best to look as slick and organised as possible, but we are actually just run by people in our spare time, and it's totally unfunded. Although where we can, we will extract resources from institutions for running costs. And today, some of our co-conspirators have joined us from Newcastle University, and we're really delighted with that. And before I start, we also wanted to thank, in particular, our designers who worked with us on the creation of the resource, which was pretty tricky at times. So within and against, in particular, thank you so much if you're here or if you're looking back on the recording. So just to give you a sense of what to expect, after I do my little welcomes, Ali will give us an overview of the resource creation and an introduction to the resource, who we are, why we made it, and what the resource entails, and what we hope it will do out in the world. I'll share my screen for some of this just so you can see the resource itself while Ali is speaking. Then Ali will introduce our speakers and facilitate our roundtable. And we are so honoured to have Lola Olufemi, Leah Cowan and Billy here to discuss their reflections on the resource. So they will be talking for about 40 minutes, and then Molly, who's also been working on the resource, will facilitate our questions and answers. So if you'd like to ask your questions in the chat, please do. But if you'd like to unmic yourself, you can also take that brave move and speak into the large Zoom call. So we'll be doing the question and answers for about half an hour, hopefully. And then I will come back and just remind people of the discussion group and just to end the call. But before I hand over, we wanted to just highlight some things. I'm sure you're aware of the state of the world, so we don't need to highlight it, but there is a lot going on. A lot needs to stop. Ceasefire now in Free Palestine. We're currently going through an election in the so-called United Kingdom. So Tories out, and as they say here in the north of Ireland, up workers and up queers. But we particularly wanted to highlight that this topic affects most of us, some more than others. It's a sensitive one, and we at Abolitionist Futures usually try and approach these things assuming that most people have direct experience of violence and even attachments to the work that's gone on to end violence and gender-based violence in particular, whether they're abolitionist or not. So we all have a lot of untangling to do, but during this call, we try and encourage you to be aware of your emotional landscape, your boundaries and your needs, particularly using online platforms. It is more difficult to feel connected online sometimes. And in all of our collective work, we try and challenge all forms of bigotry, hate, discrimination, racism, transphobia, and we are living through a particular shit show right at the moment. Ableism and disrespect, but let's be honest, we don't always get it right. And here we try to work through the tricky things. And if you have to take a little break, or if you need to speak to someone in a breakout room, we can facilitate that. This is a public event and will be recorded, as we said, but if you need to step away for your own needs or just to make your dinner, you can come back to it later and pick it up. So don't feel like you have to kind of sit through it all. So I'm going to hand over to Ali, and Ali is going to introduce the resource and our speakers, and I'll be back towards the end of the call. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ali.
Thanks so much, Mo, and thanks everybody so much for coming. It's really lovely to see so many people here. So as you know, the resource has been developed by Abolitionist Futures in collaboration with frontline support workers, community organisers and researchers. I'm Ali Phipps. I'm a sexual violence researcher and I was part of the team. So I've been asked to introduce the resource, and you'll see other people from the team later on in the event. So we basically wanted to make the resource as a tool for discussion about ways to address gender-based violence that don't rely on police and prisons. And we decided to create it because we saw a growing interest in abolition in this country after the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the cases of Nicole Smallman, Bieber Henry and Sarah Everard. And of course, abolition work has been going on here since the 1970s, but abolition has recently come into the mainstream in a way that it wasn't before. In my own work, I've definitely noticed a shift in the questions I get when I talk about abolition, from don't be so bloody stupid to, you know, okay, how do we do this? And this resource is a way of approaching that question. And of course, that question is especially tricky when it comes to gender-based and sexual violence, because when we try to introduce abolition, the response is so often, what about the rapists? And our ideas about taking survivors seriously can be fused with the idea of punishment as opposed to accountability. It's very difficult to unfuse that. And even if we support the principle of abolition, it can be especially difficult to see practical steps of how do we do it. So we can understand in the abstract that police and prisons are harmful, but how do we practically divest from those systems when they're all around us and when they seem to symbolize safety for so many people? So the resource is not an answer. There's no easy answers. And in fact, it's organized around a series of questions. So for each strategy it covers, it asks things like, does this reduce the scale of police power? Or does this challenge the idea that police and prisons equal safety? These are the things we need to ask ourselves as we work towards abolition step by step. So it's not about closing all the prisons tomorrow. It's about loosening that carceral grip on how we address harm, always with our eyes on that horizon of a world where police and prisons are no longer necessary. So the resource compares two things, what we've called carceral reforms and abolitionist strategies. Carceral reforms are ways of tackling gender-based violence that do end up expanding the harms of the criminal legal system, policing, incarceration in prisons and immigration detention centres and other things. And we've tried to explain why. And then in contrast, abolitionist strategies take a more holistic approach and don't do harm in order to address harm. So we've listed a number of strategies that can tackle gender-based violence while reducing the scope, scale and funding channeled into the criminal legal system without criminalising survival, and while building community harm reduction and harm prevention skills. And this is not just talk, it's action. Practical steps towards building collective safety and well-being for all, rather than protecting some at the expense of others. If you've seen the resource already, then you'll know it has two parts. So there's a chart that compares carceral reforms and abolitionist strategies. And then there's a booklet that considers each strategy in more detail. And the booklet also has a key. So it shows which strategies focus on personal transformation, which on changing dominant institutions, and which on building alternatives. So we really hope that you'll find it useful. And as I've said, it doesn't provide all the answers, but it can support conversations. And it's a practical tool. So when people say, how do we do this? There's something to offer. And we've got some wonderful speakers here to reflect on the resource for and with us. So I'm going to introduce them now. We'll do a more structured roundtable type discussion first, and then we'll open it up to the whole group for questions afterwards. Feel free, as Tina's said, to put questions in the chat while we're talking. So our first speaker is Leah Cowan, who is a writer and editor. Her second book, Why Would Feminists Trust the Police, will be published in June 2024, and it's brilliant. You should all buy it. June 2024, that's now. I've just realized that's now. I just read it off the script and, you know, didn't even, is it out now? You can buy it now. Oh my goodness, you can buy it now. You should go buy it now. It's a fantastic book. And Leah also works at Project 17, which is an advice centre for migrant families who have no recourse to public funds and are facing homelessness and destitution. We also have Lola Olufemi, who is a Black feminist writer and Stuart Hall Foundation researcher from London, based in the Centre for Research and Education in Art and Media at the University of Westminster. Lola's work focuses on the uses of the political imagination and its relationship to cultural production, political demands and futurity. Lola's the author of Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power, which was out in 2020, which is amazing, and Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, which was out in 2021 and is also amazing. Lola is also a member of Bare Minimum, which is an interdisciplinary anti-work arts collective. And then last but not least, we have Billy, who is a therapist, facilitator and trauma support worker based in Scotland. They work with LGBTQ people and survivors of sexual violence. Over the last few years, Billy's focus has been on creating spaces and resources that enable both survivors and their supporters to redefine justice as something we can access for and by ourselves. They work independently with gender-based violence organisations and with grassroots community groups. So I'm really thrilled to have all of you with us. Thank you so much for your time. And to start with, I think we wanted to just invite you to share your reflections on the resource and what you think of it. And can I start with you, Leah, please?
Thank you, Ali, for that introduction. Really pleased to be here today and to be speaking alongside Billy and Lola. So yes, thank you for having me along. I wanted to start with a question posed by Insight, which is a US-based anti-violence activist organisation that we reference in the booklet because, as Ali said, I was involved in the creation of the resource. And the slightly paraphrased quote is, the question is not, should we call the police? The questions are, why is that our only option? And can we provide other options that will keep us truly safe? And I think what the resource offers to the people that I'm working with specifically, so that's people from migrant communities, some of whom are undocumented, all of whom have no recourse to public funds, is a more robust approach to harm reduction and violence reduction that is not just about a response after the fact, but is about prevention, is about care and healing and justice for everybody in all of the forms that might take. And I just wanted to touch on a few examples of why calling on the state to address gender-based violence doesn't really work, and why this resource is therefore so important in offering practical strategies that do work. So we know that the police work in partnership with border enforcement and they share data with the Home Office. So calling the police or reporting to the police can have really catastrophic impacts on a person's life. It could lead to immigration enforcement action, even if charges are dropped or no further action is taken. And we also know that there's a pipeline between prisons and immigration detention centres. So the 2007 Borders Act means that the state can automatically make a decision to deport somebody who isn't a British citizen if they're given a 12-month prison sentence. So what that means is if someone receives a prison sentence, and prison sentences is something that a lot of campaigning has been done around in the gender-based violence sector, that can lead to them automatically being deported, which then entrenches cycles of harm and poverty for that person, as well as for their family members and community members who are either left behind in the UK or may have been living elsewhere and be dependent on that person's income from their job in the UK. And kind of thirdly, we know that one of the key strategies of the border regime is to make people's lives here unlivable. There's this ongoing attempt to create a hostile environment for racialized and migrant communities in the UK. And this is a kind of web of laws and policies that basically pushes people into poverty, into situations of labor exploitation, and into situations of harm where people are particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence and have no way to escape that situation through gaining, for example, financial independence, safe accommodation, etc., because all of those safety nets are stripped away by the hostile environment. So the idea that one arm of the state, the criminal legal system, would be interested in supporting people facing gender-based violence when at the same time another arm of the state, the Home Office, has stripped away or blocked that person's ability to simply buy food, have a safe bed to sleep in, this isn't an idea that makes sense. We know that it's not effective to place our trust in the state to reduce harm when the state has been very clear and plain about its intention to produce harm for migrant communities. So I think this resource poses some really important strategies for addressing gender-based violence in a way that is practical and linked to kind of real life experiences as well.
Thanks so much, Leah, and thanks for that really tangible example as well. I think that's really important. Lola, can I come to you next just for your general thoughts about the resource?
Absolutely. I want to say also a huge thank you to the Abolitionist Futures team for the resource and also for inviting me to speak alongside Leah and Billy. I guess I wanted to start with thinking about the urgency and necessity of a resource like this, especially in the context that we find ourselves in, which is, you know, almost like 2 decades into an austerity regime that has killed, continues to leave people in absolute poverty, continues to leave people absolutely destitute. Also, another kind of dimension of that necessary context is thinking about gender-based violence. Thinking just the other day, actually, I was looking at some stats that Black Lives Matter had collected about reported instances of femicide in 2023, and how out of 13 reported incidences of femicide, 8 of those include 8 of those people were Black women. And I think that it's important to take into account how this resource talks not only about gender-based violence, but also talks about the disproportionate impacts that gender-based violence or carceral solutions to gender-based violence has for those who are racialized, has for sex workers, or for those who belong to the queer community, people who are disabled, etc. So we can't really think about gender-based violence without thinking about other forms of carceral violence, without thinking about the border, how it demarcates who belongs and who doesn't, without thinking about the prison, without thinking about how in times of crisis, states essentially elect to kind of shift their responsibility to provide food, education, healthcare, and other resources onto kind of corporations and private bodies, essentially abandoning populations, right? And then using carceral solutions to consolidate their power, right? So when people, as has been said before, don't have access to housing, education, etc., and they commit, quote unquote, a crime, the state is then able to reaffirm and reinforce its remit by, you know, designating some people criminal and others not. I think another thing that this report does really well is take seriously the way that the state mobilizes gender and specifically anxieties about violence, which we all share, right? In order to provide the illusion of protection. I think it really strips back this idea that, one, we keep each other safe, and we always have, and we always will, but also that in our communities, we actually possess a lot more resources to, quote unquote, protect each other, to heal cycles of trauma, etc., than outside bodies, which I think is something that in a political landscape that is intent on dispossessing individuals and siphoning us off and kind of alienating us from one another is really important to remember. I'll just say 2 quick more things. I think this work also emerges, as Ali kind of already said, out of the legacy of rebellion, riots, and protests that have emerged around forms of state violence from about 2013. So it's important for us to contextualize that the kind of interest in abolition emerges from a place where, you know, in 2013, 2016, people were making demands around state violence, and the state was saying, we can redress this through reform. And actually, we find ourselves in a historical cycle where now we see the failure of the reforms enacted in 2013, in 2016, etc. And we're living in that aftermath. So abolition provides us a new kind of avenue for thinking about this particular conjuncture that we find ourselves in right now. And the last thing I'll say is I've kind of, when talking about abolition, one thing that came up for me when I was reading this is that this resources emphasis on the need for resource, or the need for things like mutual aid, forms of community and community intervention that don't involve the police, for example, how that is really filling the gap between what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls like organized violence and organized abandonment. So we have a situation in which, as a population, we've been essentially abandoned by the state, right? And actually, what a lot of the proposals in the resource do really well is show us that, okay, if we cannot get housing, if we cannot get resources from the state, then we have to find ways to support one another through our experiences of poverty, through our experiences of the border, of detention, etc. And so, yeah, there's a real emphasis on kind of solidaristic action. And that's really important because abolition is a lifelong project. So I'll kind of end there.
Thanks, Lola. Absolutely right. And I think that more expansive concept of violence that you talked about and that politicization of protection are two of the themes that really underpinned a lot of our discussions as a group. So thank you so much. Billy, I'll come to you now.
Yeah, like Leah and Lola, I just want to say thank you for the resource and also thank you for inviting me to speak. Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation we're beginning to have. I suppose I'm coming at this as someone who's worked in a variety of settings, each with different levels of opposition and complicity with carceral state systems. Like a lot of the services that I've worked in, they've predominantly been like rape crisis services, which are deeply carceral reformist in their history and their present politics. So while I've done some like grassroots work and I've done work that opposes the violence of borders and prisons, I've also spent a lot of time doing work that this resource will rightly tell you is reformist in its aims and in its outcomes. And so when I'm looking at this resource, what I'm thinking about is like the conversations that I hear in those spaces, the resistance and the kind of stuckness in gender-based violence services, and actually how useful this is in pushing those conversations. I guess I feel committed to both imagining what we can do outside of the services that we have, but there is some degree to which I feel like I also find myself committed to trying to create change with what we have. I want to do both things. And I guess that's like when I think about support workers and I think about like the sector, trauma support workers, frontline workers are the people, whether they describe themselves as critical of prisons and police or carceral systems or not, they are people who will be able to tell you and describe really accurately the harm and violence of the criminal justice system, because we're seeing it again and again. Even when we're working in services that serve the very narrow population that the criminal justice system is designed to serve, we're still seeing the like damage and the violence that the criminal justice system does to them, but also to the people that have harmed them. And so I guess I noticed this kind of stuckness in the commitment to criminal justice and carceral feminism in these spaces, and the limits in the imagination about what could be done differently. And that's strange when you put that alongside the experience that you have of just seeing how much it doesn't work, even for the people that it's supposed to work for, and then still this commitment to it, this really deep commitment to it. And I think that's what's powerful about this tool, is that I guess in the spaces that I work in, abolition is often dismissed as something that's like an imaginative idealist project. But I think that the way that this tool lays out the fact that that there are things that we're already doing, we don't need to necessarily come up with new alternatives. There are already things that either we're doing or communities have to do, like when Leah's talking about the ways that communities who are excluded from criminal justice system, who are themselves criminalized by the criminal justice system, those are the places that we can look to for alternatives, for ways to work, ways to take care of each other, because people have been doing it for a long time, since before the criminal justice system. And I think that's what this resource makes really clear, is that there are lots of things that we're already doing, that we just need to do more of in order to progress abolitionist aims. So it feels constructive as well as critical, like very practical, clear, but also affirming of the good work that's already happening in community and in some support services. I guess I can see that being helpful in building like motivation rather than depletion, you know, about like, I think about like tired support workers that are like struggling to imagine how to do things differently. This feels like motivating, it feels energizing and supportive in the alternatives that it like details, I guess. Yeah, I guess like just one thing that it made me reflect on, it reminded me about one of my clients who I worked with for a number of years. They were someone who went through the criminal justice process. And at the end of it, they, like most people I work with in that role, felt that the system, even the conviction that it resulted them in, that it gave them nothing, changed nothing, and had taken too much from them and also too much from the person that had harmed them. They told me that what they learned was that the system itself is a distraction, that the system had distracted them from their own healing, from continuing to live, from continuing to move on. And I think that's true of support services too. And this resource is really good at making that clear, that gender-based violence support services are very successfully distracted and co-opted by criminal justice systems, like taken away from doing the real healing and justice work that's needed and that the state would prefer us not to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Billy. And I think that when you said the different levels of opposition to and complicity with carceral systems, I think some people on the call will probably feel very seen by that. And it's really important to acknowledge that. And I think that that stuckness in GBV services is something that we were very aware of, and it's something Molly writes about, and it's something that we want to help with through the resource. And I love what you say about building motivation rather than depletion. I think that's such a powerful framing. I mean, the first question really is kind of following on from what you said, Billy, which is about, you know, some of the challenges of divesting from the police and prison system, and then the possibilities of divesting from the police and prison system based on the work that you've done. I don't know whether you want to share anything more on that, Billy, or whether we should go to Leah or Lola. Up to you. I mean, you've kind of answered that already, I think, but is there anything more that you want to say?
I guess I suppose it's just good to acknowledge how successful, and I think this resource does, how successful the criminal justice system is in weaving itself into so many other systems of support. Like, it's hugely coercive and it's hugely embedded in many of the essential services that we want to connect survivors with. So there are lots of situations that are detailed in the report, some of which are like mandatory reporting, like the pressure on workers to essentially police our clients. But also like thinking about like child contact systems, the way that like social work operates as a kind of secondary wing of police. So that if somebody wants to get more space or put space between them and an abusive co-parent or somebody who's harmed them and their children, how it can be essential to have engaged with police or criminal justice or these systems. It's actually not possible for some people to get that space, or it feels not possible without reporting or engaging these systems. And like same with people who are most at risk, you know, like people who are maybe at risk of domestic homicide, that often triggers like multi-agency processes. So in order to like engage emergency housing, you also are then automatically engage with police and social work, and all of these systems know about you, but they also know about the person who has caused you harm. And so I guess changing the relation to police, or it also involves changing the relation to all of these state services. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a powerful web, isn't it? Can I, Lola, I see you've unmuted. Could I come to you next?
Yeah,
that?
I kind of wanted to like continue and kind of respond to what Billy had said. There's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, which is like when we're talking about environments in which police power is deeply embedded into our pre-existing institutional systems that we might use to help people when they have experienced gender-based violence. I think we also have to think about how we're in a social landscape where often when we do try to make interventions, or as feminists or as people who care about those in prison, we can fall into a trap of making these kind of like proto-abolitionist arguments to say, you know, on the basis of gender, to say, you know, pregnant women don't deserve to be in prison, or a specific subsection of people don't deserve to be in prison. And there's a real, the reason why I say it's something I think about a lot is because that is meaningful and worthwhile work, especially in the context that we find ourselves in the UK. But it also, I think, pushes us back into a trap of having to make an argument about a threshold of deservingness to a public that is just learning about abolition. And so I think another thing that's difficult about trying to entangle our pre-existing systems also from police is that, but also how the violence of co-optation from police, but also from the general public is always there, right? If we feel like as abolitionists, we have to make the most publicly accessible, persuasive argument, then we do something to some of the kernels of like the thinking that abolition gives us about how we approach prisons, how we approach policing, and how we speak about people in prison. I don't know whether people have thoughts on that, but it's something that I think, especially in the context of the violence against women sector, that we see constantly alongside calls for the, you know, the further criminalization of specific acts through hate crime legislation, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Leah, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, I think kind of jumping on that point, I wanted to reflect on the way that abolition kind of pivots away from this obsession with punishment and with criminalization, as Lola has said, and why that pivot matters so much. And I wanted to give a bit of an example from my work. So I've worked with almost 200 different families with no recourse to public funds over the past few years. And some of the common threads that I've discussed with these families is not that they want more interactions with police or more prison sentences for the institutions or the people that have harmed them. But the main things they talk about is they kind of need somewhere to live, and they need money to buy food. These are the kind of recurrent demands that people have, the current needs that people have. And these are urgent needs, and that makes sense. Because in many cases, people's experiences of gender-based violence are directly linked to the deprivation of these things. So money, safe housing, comfortable housing. And in many cases, people are afraid because they might be living in a violent situation and they can't leave, or they might have left and they're sleeping on a friend's sofa or sleeping on buses or park benches, or, you know, sitting in McDonald's overnight with children and walking the streets whilst children are at school. They might not be able to work, so perhaps someone's undocumented and they're not able to buy, you know, food for themselves or their family, or they are working unlawfully, working without permission, as the state says, and they're being controlled by an employer or a partner with threats that they will inform the Home Office if that person doesn't kind of comply with them in some way. And in many of these cases, people, you know, choose not to report to the police because the risk of an immigration enforcement is too high. In some cases, people have reported to the police and nothing has happened, or the violence has escalated by police intervention. So I think I kind of sketch out some of those scenarios to point to the ways in which rejecting a carceral approach to gender-based violence and instead focusing on what survivors need in the here and now, kind of material needs as fundamental to care, healing and justice, I think are quite clear. And listed in the resource, I think in the booklet, it's Abolitionist Strategies 10 and 11, right at the end, are housing for all and building long-term economic justice. And I think it's important to center these as vital harm reduction objectives that have a direct link to reducing gender-based violence, not just thinking about gender-based violence as a kind of spontaneous occurrence, but thinking about the site where violence can be compounded and how vulnerability is manufactured and produced by the border regime, by the state, and considering carefully where exploitation and control can happen and how we address that. And it's through that abolitionist pivot away from punishment and criminalization and towards the kind of simple question of what do people need?
That's so good, Leah. You're kind of introducing my next question, really. You're doing my job for me. So I'm really kind of struck by these very tangible examples that you're providing, which are so useful. And they also really fly in the face of that common objection to abolitionist thinking, which is that it's too utopian, it's not practical enough. And I think you've already partially responded to this through what you've said, but is there anything else that you'd like to say in response to that? And I don't know whether you want to carry on, Leah, or whether Billy or Lola, you want to take this one first.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of jump in. I mean, I think it's, as I said in my previous answer, I see abolitionist work as incredibly pragmatic in that it addresses the root causes of harm. It builds strategies from a place that tries to reduce these causes rather than kind of papering over the symptoms. At the same time, and Lola's work is a really great example of this, abolitionist thinking requires us to expand our imaginations, to utilize our ideas, our needs, our hopes, our desires, and our dreams as a kind of source and a resource for that practical action, which I think is very different to kind of utopian pie in the sky. At the same time, I see carceral responses to violence, so whether that's police, prisons, immigration detention centres, deportation, all of that kind of infrastructure, based in not only quite a confected fantasy of what harm is, but also of what justice is. So on one hand, we can see that the criminal legal system cherry picks what types of harms it is bothered about. So it's not that fussed about prosecuting states or companies that push people into poverty. It's not that bothered about people on banks that cause financial crashes. It's not that fussed about states and transnational alliances that massacre people in wars and genocides. And we've particularly mentioned Palestine right at the beginning today. At the same time, it promotes a very kind of punishment forward law and order response as the only way to solve, in quote marks, this specific handful of harms that it seems to be bothered about. On the other hand, there's another layer of fantasy in the kind of carceral response to gender-based violence, in that the criminal legal system isn't very good at solving the things that it allegedly claims to solve. Many of us on this call will be very familiar with low rates of prosecutions around things like rape, female genital mutilation, and modern slavery, which is actually just kind of more border enforcement in disguise. And to be clear, I'm not saying that these low rates of prosecutions need to be improved, but I think it's quite useful to point to the fact that carceral approaches to gender-based violence don't actually do the thing that they claim to be doing. It's the least practical thing ever. The idea of these carceral responses actually solving the issue, that is the fantasy. We can see in reality that it doesn't work.
Thanks, Leah. I think that is such a powerful thing. Where is the fantasy actually located? It's such a good response. Billy, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, I guess there's I like that the theme of kind of illusion and deception of the criminal justice system is coming up a lot. I think nothing is more impractical, idealistic, or illusory than the criminal justice system itself. It's I think I recently found out that the new prison, the HMP Glasgow, which is going to replace Barlinnie, a very old prison in Glasgow, is currently under construction. And I found out recently that that's going to cost £400 million to build that single prison. And I guess and I think about practicality, you just think about that sum of money and how that's going to increase social harm is going to necessarily increase gender-based violence, sexual violence, all kinds of harm, rather than to go any way to solving social problems like homelessness or wealth disparity or addictions, or gender-based violence in the community. And you just think about what you could spend £400 million on. If we were to look in this resource and look at the suggestions for like abolitionist strategies and just think how many of those things could be achieved. Like thinking about a city like Glasgow, how many homes could be built with £400 million. It's like, that's what's impractical. Yeah, that it feels clear to me when I think about the money specifically.
Absolutely. And Lola, to you, I mean, you write about the imagination, but your work is definitely not pie in the sky. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this.
I think I think this is a really interesting question. And when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about how I think in like 2020, I read something from somebody who runs a women's service. Basically, it was kind of this op-ed about how abolition is a pie in the sky thing and it will never happen. And I was kind of rereading it, and actually what she says in it, what I found so interesting was that, you know, I'm sympathetic to the arguments that abolition makes, but none of this will happen unless capitalism ends. And I was like, yeah, like absolutely. That's I find it interesting that in the critique of abolition, there was some recognition there, not only about like, you know, the extent of police violence, but also this idea that you can't become an abolitionist, you can't become a student of abolition without ultimately understanding how the lack of resource or the way, or this idea of elective precarity, the way the state produces precarity is also intimately connected to flows of money, flows of capital, the way society is organized around labor exploitation. And those are really important connections to make. And obviously a lot of people come to abolition without thinking through that first, obviously, for lots of different reasons. But I think the second that you begin to ask the question that Leah said earlier, what do people need? And then you begin to assess why in your local area, for example, people don't have the things that you need, then you understand the role of privatization, you understand the role of corporations really guzzling up housing, for example, buying huge plots of land to build houses for extortionate rates that nobody will be able to live in, etc. And you see how those cycles are connected to capitalism. I think it's important to remember when we encounter this question of utopianism, that like abolition is one facet of a radical political genealogy that wants to change every single thing. And so in some ways, rather than running away from the charge of like, you want to do so much, I think we say it's precisely because we care about everybody that we are adding so much complexity in thinking about this question of what do people need? And also that we make this argument that we live in a world where we actually have enough resource for all, right? But what capitalism does is create a false sense of scarcity, which also gets in the way of the solidaristic actions that we might take in our local communities, right? Because you're thinking what's mine is mine, and every other person is either out to harm me or take the things that I have. And so on a kind of like personal level, I feel like abolition gives us a way of thinking through that. I think, yeah, the project, as people who have, and hopefully people in this call who are committing yourselves to thinking about how to reorganize the social world, which is a lifelong project, there's no straightforward solution to that. And there is no answer to that, right? You just have to struggle, you have to fight, you have to make interventions where you can. And so, yeah, the charge of like wanting the things to be better, I think should be worn actually as a badge to say, yes, I would like the world to be better than it currently is. That's never an insult, I think.
Absolutely, amen to that. And you're so right. It's not about scarcity, it's about distribution. And when you understand that, then suddenly abolition thinking doesn't seem quite so utopian, as you've said. It's political economy, isn't it? So I have one more question to ask you before we open to the group. Just really briefly, in the last 5 minutes, we just wanted to ask you how you think you might use the resource in your own work or in your own community or in your own thinking. And I don't mind who wants to go first. Do you want to go, Leah?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I guess two kind of quick ways. I work in the charity sector, so I will be, sharing it with colleagues, particularly those working in like a policy campaigning space, to make sure that when arguments are being made around, you know, what needs to happen, that we're not calling for new forms of criminalization, that when we're calling on the state to kind of do anything, we're basically asking them to undo all of the harm and the rubbish and the legislation that they've created that makes people's lives hard. The second point, kind of thinking about the different forms of harm reduction the resource offers and the real emphasis on prevention, I think is really important for me. So when I'm working with survivors or people who are undocumented and, you know, in a space where they're experiencing state violence, I'm constantly thinking about what are the things that can increase safety in the context of the way the state and the border regime vulnerabilize people. And I think the resource and the booklet expand on the strategy of mutual aid and community support. And I think it's really useful to think about how isolation compounds violence and how could linking people up to community groups, peer support groups, you know, parent and baby groups, faith-based groups, help that person to build their support network in a way that doesn't leave them totally isolated without any help or support, whether that's, you know, emotional or material support, and therefore more vulnerable to violence and exploitation. So yeah, thinking about that rich tapestry of prevention and the way that we can reduce violence in that respect.
Thanks so much, Leah. Who wants to go next? Lola?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I think I have, I think what immediately came to mind is giving this resource to my friends who are social workers, who think of social work as like an inherently benevolent task and activity, especially because that is also another institution or another area that is intimately tied up with the police. And another way that the state makes things like housing, things like education, things like healthcare intimately tied up with policing, how they make health practitioners, for example, mini police officers, and social workers, mini police officers. So I think for me, this resource will be really useful in to give to people who work in those areas to be able to help challenge the assumption of benevolence and to help them identify the ways actually that their work is intimately tied up with carcerality, and how they might be able to, as individuals, as part of a union, actually do a bit of that unpicking. I also think that what I love about this resource is that I also feel like I could share it with people to just begin a conversation and to start a conversation. I always, you know, get on the train and see this like advert from HSBC, which is about like, you know, if you're experiencing financial abuse, you can like let us know. And I think I always want to like, you know, start a conversation with the person that I'm with that basically starts with the question, you know, why is a bank offering this? Why isn't this something that people are able to find in their local community? And I think that this resource helps in kind of expanding our understandings of what counts as support, what counts as safety, but also, yeah, it goes a long way in answering the question of like why a corporation is offering this service rather than, you know, the state, which wants to affirm kind of police power. Yeah, and I think lastly, I'll say that what I really loved also in reading this resource was one thing that it said, which is like, to end violence, we need something like, to end violence, we need everybody. And I think that is such a kind of call to action. It's like everybody has their role, but we need everybody to take part, right? And I think it's I see it as part of a long history of groups like the Haringey Black Women's Centre, OAD, you know, Brixton Black Women's Group, who provided forms of political education to local communities as a means of mobilization, as a way to say, okay, how do we begin to provide each other with the resources that we need, right? It's a good starting point for creating those networks that help survival, essentially. So those are all of the ways that I will be encouraging other people to use it and using it myself.
Thanks so much, Lola. And Billy, would you like to round us up?
Yeah, I guess yeah, a few things. Like, I guess I find it like a really useful kind of navigational tool, like a thing to come back to kind of anchor into like I guess holding on to like an abolitionist direction, particularly when I work in a situation that can be very disorienting in the kind of like carceral logics that are around a lot of the time. So there's something helpful about it, something to come back to kind of check your motivation, check what you're doing, check where you're directing your energy, your care, your skills, your labor. And I guess I imagine using it too in the places that I work in the charities and services that I work in, to try and build like pressure, build collective pressure towards like divestment from criminal justice, of redirection of resources. I think there are limits to how far I think that can go in the gender-based violence sector right now, but I certainly think there are like ways that we can focus on some of these abolitionist strategies more than the carceral reforms that are listed here. But I guess maybe when I just think about like the work that I do with survivors, this thing about focusing on what you're already doing, on the like in the abolitionist work and the transformative work that is already happening. I think that kind of rhymes with like a way that I find the most useful to work with survivors too. It's like survivors who are reaching for the criminal justice system, it's because they want to do something. They want to do something about like violence that's happened to them, harm that's happened to them. And actually, like as workers, I think it's most important that we like dispel the illusions of the criminal justice system as something that is going to meet that desire, that is going to actually meet those needs that they have, because that's highly unlikely, as we know, but also to like support them to focus on what they're already doing, on like finding a sense of agency, on finding a sense of like ways in which they're bringing about justice for themselves, for each other, how they might do that in their community. Like there's something about how this resource does that for us as people who are interested in like furthering abolitionist aims, that I think is also really important in working therapeutically with survivors, in helping them see that they're already enacting a sense of justice in their own lives. They're already surviving, they're already living through really difficult experiences. They're already meeting the needs that they might want the criminal justice system to meet.
Thank you so much, all of you, for some really fantastic thoughts. And the chat, there's been so much going on in the chat. There's a lot of questions coming, so I will hand over now to Molly, who will ask you some of the questions that have come from the group. But thank you, that was great.
Yeah, thank you. My head is abuzz with thoughts. I have my own questions, but I will restrain myself and kind of paraphrase back some of the questions that we've had from people. I'm going to kind of block them together. And also, if anyone would like to verbally ask a question, do please just pop your hand up and I will come to you in a second. But I think one of the questions is a kind of around resistance, and all of you spoke kind of about the kind of ways in which the criminal legal system and kind of carceral systems and structures and logics, they really weave their way into our lives. And some of the questions that we've had from people in the chat were kind of about this. So Tom asked a question about the kind of carceral role of social services, and Ellie asked a question about how the state kind of frequently co-opts radical language around things like transformational justice, kind of making it less about accountability and more about kind of other carceral violences. And I wonder if any of you could speak about what it looks like in practice to resist either those specific kind of practices, or kind of any kind of resistance in your life, and kind of all the while navigating how kind of exhausting and demoralizing that can be. Kind of like how do we resist, but resist in a way that is infused with care for ourselves and others. Kind of like, yeah, even to the very minutiae of how we have kind of really difficult conversations with people in services.
And I can certainly speak to it in terms of like contact with police, and like seeing the way that police are extremely successful in absorbing language, absorbing ideas. Like police will very commonly dismiss like abusive or harmful behavior, you know, like all of their behavior is abusive and harmful, but I'm talking about like specific instances where they've like really caused harm to like someone that I've been working with, and they will describe that as like an officer who's experiencing burnout, or an officer who is like basically suffering because of exerting violence. Like there's that they've taken a language that's about like being close to the effects of violence, and they're not making a distinction between the difference between like, yes, it exerts a cost on you as a human being to be enacting violence in the world. There is a cost of that, but it's not what we're talking about when we talk about burnout or vicarious trauma or like compassion fatigue, or all of these languages that are about like or just being traumatized, like being traumatized and feeling the effects of enacting violence in the world are they're not necessarily totally separate, but they're different experiences.
Thank you, Billy. I don't know, Leah or Lola, if you would like to respond. Lola, I can see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I think this is a tricky one, because I do think that we are in an age where we're really used to seeing institutions and policing bodies and other carceral bodies just really use the language that they have deemed popular on like Twitter and other sites, and it's like very disorientating. But I do think it's worth like staking a claim for our language, and I think the way that we do that is to historicize it, and also to define our terms properly, right? Like, so it's important, like by historicize it, I mean historicize the role of violence in the history of policing, right? Call things what they are. So this resource does a really good job of defining, you know, the criminal legal system against the criminal justice system, for example. That's just like one very small example. But I think that trying to find ways of thinking about the history and function of the police in this country that centralize its violence, right? So that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we are comparing where like real police violence happens in America or in other countries and not in the UK, understanding actually how the lives of racialized people in this country have always been intimately tied with the violence of policing is one way. And I think also like, by what I mean by, I guess, like defining our terms is, especially as feminists, especially as people who work in the violence against women sector, it's important when a body that, you know, enables one of its officers to go and murder somebody, right, and then uses the language of bad apples, that we have a real robust like a lexicon to oppose that, to say this is what we mean when we say solidarity or gender or any of these terms, right? And this is what we mean when we say that bad apples can't possibly exist. I think we're also in a context where a lot of, in terms of the public perception of the police, more so than I would say 5 or 10 years ago, it has really been eroded by extreme kind of instances of violence, which is why we are seeing such a rise in policing PR, right? So in a way that alerts us to the fact that we are in an interesting space in terms of what we can do in terms of political education, in terms of challenging the normative power of policing, especially through language. So that's only one avenue, but I do think language matters in this context, or else you end up not being able to know who is on your side, right? Because the police are saying burn out and you're also saying burn out. So it doesn't really, you know, make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And like these terms really matter. And I think something that the resource tries to do a little bit is to help us kind of be really specific about some of those terms as well. Leah?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the point about the kind of carceral role of social services, which I could bang on about forever, but I will try not to. Social services have very much become about gatekeeping resources from a position of scarcity in a context of austerity. And, you know, lots of people I work with have had really horrific experiences of social workers. I think it's also, when we're thinking about how to kind of communicate this resource to people, it's useful to recognize that this confected scarcity that, you know, local authorities are working on the basis of is truly felt by the workers, by social workers who are, you know, experiencing pressures by managers, they're overstretched, they're not being resourced in a way that would enable them to support families, even if that's what the state wanted them to do, right? So, you know, there are also cultures of disbelief and classism and racism and ableism baked into these institutions. And, you know, in the context of the hostile environment, social services sometimes have embedded immigration officers, they have embedded fraud departments where if a family with no recourse to public funds is seeking support, they will be investigated to make sure they're not making a fraudulent claim for support, you know, hiding income or something like that. And I worked with somebody where a social worker was refusing a family support because they had an expensive pram, which it turned out had been gifted to them, and they had a bottle of perfume in their bedroom, which the social worker said was, you know, a luxury item, and therefore how could the family be destitute? So kind of in that context, I think it's quite useful to think about how are we going to communicate this resource to those social workers working under those pressures, working in those structures where these are the attitudes and ideas that are very pervasive. I think there's a way that if you're a frontline worker having direct communication with people in these institutions, we can think about challenging language on a very kind of one-to-one basis. So, you know, conversations where social workers are talking about people being illegal, you know, pushing back against that and reframing and suggesting alternative language and, you know, why that language doesn't make sense. Pushing back against attitudes that social workers are displaying that maybe are, you know, coming from the structures they're working within. So yeah, I've heard a lot social workers suggesting that people should go back to where they came from, this very kind of overtly racist language, and it's important to challenge that. And then kind of thinking about what practices can be shared and improved. And specifically on the point of social workers, I think there's a group called Social Workers Without Borders who are doing quite a lot of good stuff around challenging those attitudes and, you know, language and practices within the institutions. So yeah, that's just a couple of thoughts on social services specifically.
Thank you. And that point around kind of the importance of challenging, I think, is also connected to how we challenge within the services that we're based within as well. And we had a few questions about kind of focus and where we begin. And one of the questions in particular was around kind of how we bring this into the frontline services directly. Like what do we do? Where should we begin? And what does that mean when kind of maybe the organisation won't go in that direction? And does that mean that we leave people without support? It's a really big question.
Could you say the question again, Molly? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was just a question of, obviously we're speaking about resistance and how we kind of do this kind of broader resistance, but also kind of resistance when we're in something like social services. And then we've also had questions about kind of focus. So where should we focus? Should we be focusing kind of in services? And if we're working within services, what do we do? How do we bring about these changes when the organisation itself is resistant? I think the person I'm speaking to is kind of asked a question about kind of as a GBV worker, what does that mean for kind of the survivors that we're supporting, or maybe not going to support if we make the decision to kind of enact this resistance in services?
Yeah, I guess I have an amount of empathy with that question that is, I think, working in this position of complexity and complicity, it's really challenging. But I guess I find that I spend time thinking about how I can use the space that I have, or the space I have with survivors, and the space and funding that I have in organizations, to even just in my interactions with my clients, to think about like, how am I bringing a kind of like a truthful like abolitionist perspective to what I'm doing in this one relationship, right? Like I think it's like bell hooks that talks about like justice as truth telling, that it's about like seeing the world and ourselves as it is, not how we'd like it to be, not how we need it to be, but actually being really, really honest about how it is. And I think that I think about that often in terms of gender-based violence services, because there's so many myths and so many illusions, like this binary thing between like, I mean, and it's what gender-based violence services have been selling too. We affirm it when we say like the options are like report to the police or do nothing, and that isn't true. Like that isn't, those aren't the options. And so I guess to be like responsible and accountable to this politics in that position where someone's coming to you saying, I want to report, is our responsibility to like work with them to find out why. Like, do you want to do that because you think that's the only option available to you? When you say you want to do that, do you actually know what it's going to be like when you do? What are you hoping to get out of that? Is that even something the criminal justice system is going to offer you, and at what cost? Like, we need to be thinking about informed choice. And so like informing people about the truth and the reality of the systems that they're about to engage, and thinking about it from all perspectives too, right? Because the survivors I work with, they care about what happens to the person that harmed them. They want to know that something meaningful is going to happen, or that change is going to happen, or that like it will be for something like transformative. That is usually what people want. And so actually understanding that that isn't what's going to come about, that is helping someone to make an informed choice. Because if you're not informing them of that, who's informing them of that? It's going to be the state, society, saying that, you know, we know that the way that criminal justice is sold is an illusion, it's deceptive. So I guess I think about it in that way. I think about my responsibility to inform, to use my expertise and my perspective on how much of the system I've seen to help people understand what it will and it won't give you. And I guess I find that I guess I just find that's really important, particularly when you're recognizing that the people who are often being reported are like close people. The reality is they're often family members, friends, like people in your life. They're not strangers. They're not people that you don't care about. There's like, it's complex working with people in navigating how they want to secure safety for themselves or whatever it is they're hoping to get from the criminal justice system. And the likelihood is that they're probably not going to get it.
Thank you so much, Billy, for such a beautiful reflection. And I think when you were speaking, I was also thinking about like how the kind of carceral systems and structures that we have, they don't give space for any of that complexity of the like manifold of relationships that so many of us have with people that have hurt us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leah or Lola, I don't know if either of you want to come in to any of those points.
I feel like just to add to kind of what Billy was saying, I don't have direct experience of working in the violence against women sector, but I think that like when you live in a violent like social landscape, you are always forced as a like political subject or as a person to navigate contradictions, right? Like a lot of us are engaged in violent institutions, whether they be, you know, medicine or education or whatever. There are some ways that we are always attached to spaces of contradiction and institutions that cause harm. And as you were talking, Billy, I was reflecting on the fact that, like, you know, when Sisters Uncut was started, it was mainly contained people who were frontline workers and people who held those same frustrations, right? But who were adopting a kind of in and against strategy to say, just like you did, that our individual relationships that we cultivate and the support that we offer to survivors is absolutely essential, we know, to their survival. But we know our place in this wider institution is compromised. And so we do what we can outside of, we find other spaces to advance a set of political demands, right? And I think there is a way that you can spend a lot of time thinking about whatever contradiction you inhabit, and you can think, you know, is it bad, is it good? But actually, like, being able to understand sites of power and being able to understand, okay, this is possible within this space, and actually my agency or you know, my political organizing or my robust demand making can happen in another space. And ultimately you're moving towards a situation where you want to be able to abandon what isn't working for you, what isn't working for the people that you're attempting to help. And I think that the in and against pressure allows that. And it's a framework that has been used historically by, you know, anti-racist feminist organizing groups in this country. And one that I think, you know, we need to bring back in a really robust way, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Leah, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to respond to now. Everyone did such a beautiful job just then as well. So kind of something that you mentioned, Lola, earlier, kind of I wanted to come back to because it really connects with some of the questions that we've had in the chat. You spoke about kind of the importance of defining our terms, and yeah, I so agree with that. And kind of, yeah, a few of the questions were around that kind of how to define the definition, the focus of this resource, and kind of Andrew asked about whether the resource could be applicable kind of to various global contexts. Eden asked kind of if we could expand a little bit more about kind of that term gender-based violence and why it's important within abolition and abolitionist work. And Silvana also kind of spoke about whether we should be speaking about corporate power and private wealth as much as we speak about the carceral state when it comes to kind of carceral expansion, which I think is something the resource kind of gestures towards, but doesn't really kind of like, it's, you know, it's a discussion tool, it can't do everything. So yeah, I'm interested in any of your thoughts on any of those kind of very, very specific questions, or about kind of terms within the resource that you want to kind of unpack in a little bit more as well. Yeah, I don't know who would like to begin.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of jump in on the kind of point around speaking about corporate power and private wealth as much as we like speak about the carceral state. And I think, yes, absolutely is the answer. I think if we think about the border regime in particular, and increasingly the prison estate, these are very much profit-making enterprises. So, you know, immigration detention centers run by companies like, formerly by G4S, which, you know, manages the apartheid wall and is in occupied Palestine. Companies like Serco and GEO kind of run immigration detention centers in the UK. If we think about deportation charter flights, partnerships with commercial airlines, services that escort people onto deportation charter flights, asylum accommodation is privately owned by companies like ClearSpring, Mears. This is very poor quality accommodation. Bibby Stockholm, which is the kind of floating prison off the coast of Devon, is privately owned again. So the money that is ploughed into this whole enterprise, into these carceral structures, you know, is way more than the money that people would need to be supported in the community, for example, if we want to make that direct comparison via something like universal credit, if they needed that support. And, you know, blocking people from accessing higher education and work is also part of what prevents people from surviving and thriving. So not wanting to go down the kind of, you know, neoliberal migrants contribute narrative, but the idea that, you know, the border regime is a cost-effective process is one that just kind of doesn't make sense. It's an incredibly expensive enterprise, and it puts that money directly into the pocket of, you know, boards and investors of these private companies. So yeah, thank you for whoever raised that point.
It was Silvana. Yeah, and I think absolutely, and I think one of the things about the resource is that it really does, yeah, connect with those broader capitalist corporate institutions, but kind of through that lens of carceral, as you spoke to, Leah. Lola or Billy, I don't know if either of you want to speak to kind of any of the kind of the things that Leah was just saying, but or also kind of Eden's question about gender-based violence, Andrew's question about the global contexts, or anything.
Yeah, I think, sorry, could you remind me of Andrew's question, and I'll try.
So Andrew asked about kind of whether any of the panelists thought this resource could be kind of
used internet. Yeah, I guess I'll start there. I think that what I find really interesting about like practices of abolition is that I do think they change on the basis of how different states are organized, and also how resources are organized. For example, in this country, like just the existence of local councils enables us to ask us a different set of questions about how we might funnel resource into a specific area, right? But that's not applicable everywhere. And so I think that, like, whilst obviously there are like broad abolitionist principles that the resource speaks to, that obviously travel and are transnational in their operation, I do think that when we're talking about like really localized practices like of an abolitionist politics, that really often depends on not only location but culture. Like, there are so many different ways of like approaching people, how people understand, what people understand by the term community, for example. And I think that because, you know, America is a hegemonic imperialist power, I think a lot of the terms for abolitionist thinking have come through there. But I think of something, for example, like the End SARS movement in Nigeria, which was like a huge anti-police, anti-state violence, anti-police brutality series of marches, practices, protests by individuals, and how often that wasn't read through an abolitionist lens because it is illegible to understandings, to Western powers, basically, and to like some Western frameworks for understanding community, understanding what even counts as political mobilization, because some people aren't even seen as worthwhile political subjects. And so I think that the answer to that question is, rather than attempt to kind of import one stable definition, thinking about abolition as a flexible, transitory set of principles and practices that must be translated and resituated constantly is really important. And also, I guess on the question of gender-based violence, I think actually the resource itself provides a really great answer to this, to say that, what I think about the term kind of gender-based violence kind of broadly is that within, as feminists, right, we're always trying to expand our understandings of what constitutes gender, but also who is capable of enacting harm, right? There is a very binaristic and very simplified understanding of those who are subordinated and those who exert power, right? And I think what the term gender-based violence is, one, alert us or the public to the fact that any person is capable of committing harm. But also, I think maybe the question came from a kind of fear or anxiety about the erasure of violence against women. And we know, looking at statistics, we know from lived experience that women constitute a huge make up, you know, a great proportion of the people that experience violence in this world. And I don't think terms like gender-based violence actually erase that. I think they allow us to think about how that violence happens in a wider context, but also in a context in which gender is not only read as meaning woman or man, right? Where gender also names a set of relations between peoples that can be applied regardless of biological sex, in ways that are either liberating or in ways that are harmful or dangerous. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it makes total sense. And I think it also speaks to the importance of translating. Like, you've just done a really important bit of translating around that term. And I think, you know, abolitionist work is translating, and so is feminist praxis as well. It's like a constant process of translating for others and for ourselves. Billy, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add. If not, I do have a final question, a whiz-bang speedy question. No? Okay, fantastic. So I guess the final question is just one that you know, I've been mulling over myself in my own work, where I explore stuckness in feminism. And I think something that I often think about and wonder is, yeah, how we support and sustain each other when kind of the expectations and the kind of like lure of abolition, you know, I look at the abolitionist strategies and my heart sings. And then I think, you know, there's that fear of the crushing disappointment when it's not just there, it's not materialized right on my doorstep. So yeah, I just would like maybe just a sentence from you all about kind of how you find ways to support and sustain yourselves, but also kind of the communities that you're organizing within, and what it means to kind of, yeah, support and sustain each other as we do this work.
I guess for me, it's just about a practice of noticing. I think we're told that, you know, we've talked about it a lot in this session, just that the idea that the things we want to see in the world don't exist yet, or they have to be like conjured or come up with, and actually I think I just always come back to a practice of noticing. I know that if I look around, maybe at my clients, at what they're doing for themselves, maybe in my community, maybe in other communities, maybe in like organizing spaces rather than like workplaces. There's so many creative strategies and responses happening all of the time that are essential to what we're talking about here. I guess I just remind myself that it's absolutely everywhere what we want to see. It is already in existence. It's just about us making intentional choices about moving ourselves and our labor and our skills and our energy towards those things, towards noticing that they're there and that they need us to keep working towards that. I guess that helps with the feeling of scarcity or out of reachness. Just noticing.
That's really, really beautiful, and everyone's smiling, and that's really nice. I love our practice of noticing. Lola or Leah?
Yeah, I think a very, very, I mean, exactly the same as what Billy has just said, to be honest. Like, and to give a practical example of one thing that I try and kind of hold in my mind as an example. I was interviewing a Roma women's group in Albania who were supporting community members who were experiencing domestic violence, and they said, you know, it's not an option for us to call the police. The police were incredibly violent towards them. The police wouldn't even come to where they lived because the city wouldn't even build a road to where they lived, and they had to fight to even have, you know, waste collection and street lights and that kind of thing. So they were just like, calling the police is not an option. But instead they had a system where they would open up their houses to each other. So if, you know, someone needs to get some space from a partner, they would go and stay with a friend for a few days until the situation had been, you know, like a bit diffused and it might have otherwise escalated. And so not only was this a strategy that they had, it was a strategy that was very normalized among their community. So nobody got their back up if they went, you know, if you went to stay somewhere else for a few nights, that didn't kind of mean something terrible. And that was just one strategy they used to support each other as survivors. And what they said in our conversations was, and this is a quote that I often think about, we have a million ways to solve our problems. And, you know, calling the police was just never one of those methods, and they had a million other things they would do.
It really does put it into perspective, doesn't it? Just, yeah, how many things that there are available to us if we do exactly what Billy said and do that practice of noticing. Lola?
I think, I guess I could talk forever about the question of like stuckness and the effective experience of feeling as if, you know, less is possible than actually is. And I think that's something, I think it's, you know, it is created by the social landscape that we live in. And it's really important to be aware of that like any feeling of stuckness or isolation or alienation that you feel is produced, so can be undone, right? That's for me a really an important starting point. I think maybe like one or two things that I think is that something is always like changed in the doing. So like, even if I think a lot of people expect for a transformed world to, as you said, Molly, kind of like meet them on the doorstep in this very linear way. And I feel like if you begin to think in non-linear ways about the historical legacies to which you belong, about the practices of like radical connection, you know, like anti-capitalism, feminism, etc., that you are actively engaging with, and how those are not only connected to the past but actively producing a future as you do them, then small interventions that you make into social landscapes, whether that's like helping someone who, like intervening in a stop and search, for example, those carry much more social weight, and you'll feel much more courageous and much less scared if you understand that in the context of like, you know, things are moving in a circle, or I am connected to other people that have done this in the past. I am not just one individual subject. I am my life is intimately interdependent with other people. That's something that I try to remember, and something that, you know, informs my determination. I also, you know, at the most basic level, try and think about anything that I think is impossible in my social landscape is happening somewhere else in the world, right? And we see that through the example that Leah just gave, but we also see, I think this is especially important to consider if you are somebody who lives in like the West, and especially the UK and the US, because your understanding of the world can seem all-consuming, when actually, if you look at the radical histories and practices that are happening in places like Cuba, for example, a lot of demands that we're making have been actualized or realized either historically or presently. And we see that also in instances around like Palestine and university organizing as well. So it's really important to engage in radical histories outside of the imperial core, because that, I think, also, you know, affirms this sense of connection to a struggle. Yeah, and I also, I guess lastly, I'll say, you know, I think of myself, I think of the politics that I practice as a practice and not merely a set of abstracted beliefs, right? And practice involves repetition. And so when I'm faced with this question of we are doing the same thing, we are asking the same questions, it's like, of course we are. Our dreams and our visions are incredibly capacious. So they are going to really take time, right? And if I don't see it, somebody else will. That's, you know, it feels nice to give myself a task, a job to then hand on to somebody else, rather than assuming that I will see the fruition of everything, of every intervention I attempt to make.
Thank you so much, everyone. And welcome back. Well, not welcome back, it's me again. I certainly found the roundtable and the discussions amazing, and I could stay here much longer pulling the threads together, and I'm sure you could all as well. So from the questions and the speakers, we hope that you recognize that this resource doesn't provide the answers, but provides a tool, the chart, the booklet, and a discussion guide for your own discussion groups. As Lola and others have said, abolition is pragmatic work. It's an organizing strategy, and part of that strategy is political education, and that is something that our feminist movement has lost its way on. So we hope that you can use this resource as part of reviving that history of political education. Abolition is about highlighting the connections between things and our speakers, and the questions from how we raise our kids to the global capitalist, racist, colonial, corporate hell that we toil under have pulled those connections together. So we're just going to highlight the discussion groups that are happening that we know about, and really encourage you to organize your own groups in your communities or at work or amongst your friends, to use the tool to come together and talk. That is its purpose. Let us know if you're planning to host an event, and we'll pop it on our website. And please do look at the facilitation guide, which hopefully someone will be putting in the chat, that we have made to go along with this resource. And we really would encourage you also to fill in our feedback form. So if we didn't get a chance to answer any of the questions, or if you think some things could be thought about in more detail, please do fill in the feedback form. The discussion groups that are happening that we know of, our Abolitionist Futures are holding an online discussion group on Tuesday, the 25th of June, and this will be more of a chance for everyone to dive in and talk about the resource. There's an in-person event in Newcastle and in Belfast on June the 26th, and another Level Up are hosting an event online again in July the 22nd if you can't make those dates. So as I said, please do fill in the feedback form and sign up or get organizing your own discussion groups. Thanks everyone for your time and attention. Thank you especially to our speakers tonight, to our foreground and background support people, and everyone that has contributed to the resource along the way. I'm going to be listening back to this recording because it helps me to brainwash myself, and I hope that you will do that too. And also I want to do a shout out in particular to Lamble, who was unable to join us this evening, but was their usual lovely, diligent and committed self in the background, making sure that we all got here today. So thanks everyone, sorry for running over. Yeah, that's all from us, and have a good evening. Take care of yourselves and each other. Bye. Should have got a goodbye song on the go. Sorry for forgetting that, everyone. Hope you have a nice evening. And do join us for the